I invite you to stand for the reading of the Gospel. Today is coming from Mark 16, verses 1 to 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, this is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Our scriptures have 4 Gospels, and each one of those Gospels has a retelling of what happened on Easter morning. This morning's reading is from Mark. The one in sunrise service was from John. The accounts have a little bit of variation one from another. As you might imagine, if you asked people who witnessed the same event to retell you that story years later, you would expect that there will be little different details in each of their recollections, especially something that happened, like I said, a long time ago. All of the resurrection stories are very clear that the women played a central role that morning of Easter. In Mark, today's passage, the women were going to the tomb to prepare the body of Jesus for burial belatedly, because Jesus had to be put in the tomb in a bit of a hurry, because the Sabbath was about to begin, and it was either bury him right then and there or let him hang on the cross all Saturday until after they could bury him. And so that was a day, Sabbath was a day in which their faith told them they could not do any kind of work, including that. And so when the women went to the tomb, instead of encountering a dead body, which they were going to prepare, they found the tomb open, and they found a young man sitting in the tomb, and he's telling them that Jesus is not there because he's alive. He tells the women to go report this to the disciples and tell them that Jesus would catch up with them in Galilee. Now, the reaction of the women was not one of joy or vindication or even anticipation. They were alarmed. This, even though Jesus had told them that he would be killed and that he would be raised. But they had not understood what that meant. Now here is a unique detail in the retelling in Mark. So Mark says the women fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement has seized them. And there's some version of that in all the other Gospels. But in this Gospel it says, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And what's more, that's the way that Gospel ended at one point. At least that's the way it used to end. The earliest copies we have of that Gospel of Mark, this is where it ends, with the women running away and telling no one. Scholars have interpreted that verses after verse 8 were added in later copies. When early copies were made, they were literally hand copied and copied on that way from on and on. And the church at large throughout the centuries has made the decision to keep the later additions in the Gospels. And most modern Bibles, if you look at your Bible, there's going to be an asterisk or a set of brackets in that particular passage, and it's going to let you know that this was something that was added later, allowing for the possibility of either that abrupt ending was the end, or that maybe the actual ending was lost somehow throughout the centuries, or that maybe these additional verses are an acceptable way of ending the gospel to make it connect with the other gospels. But you might say, but the women must have said something, otherwise we wouldn't know about this story. Marietta's right that the women were the first ones to share the news. They were the ones that ran back. And so why have this abrupt ending then in this gospel? It's kind of timely that this year Easter happens to overlap with that irreverent of holidays, of all holidays, April Fool's. Because to end a story like that sounds like a trick, sounds like a prank, or sounds like a joke in bad taste, a prank where something is meant to be funny for only those who are watching it from the outside, not for those who are getting pranked. We don't know where April Fools, really we don't know where April Fools came from. There's some theories about it. Several countries have it here in the United States, in Europe. Mexico has one, a different date of the year. But it's a day for taking advantage of the naive. It's a day when we poke fun of those who are gullible. It's meant to be a time for jokes or tricks. And if we were watching this story of Mark, seeing the women terrified and running and then telling no one, and all of a sudden if we were watching this as a movie and all of a sudden the credits started to roll, we would say, what? Are you kidding me right now? Is this the end? It's an end that doesn't sit well. It feels incomplete. And so what I would suggest to you is that the very fact that we are talking about this on a Sunday like today is part of how the story is actually meant to end, how the actual ending is being written. When I was a little boy, I spent a few vacation weeks in a small town in southern Mexico with an uncle and our cousins. They owned a tiny corner grocery store, and they lived in the apartment above it. And we passed the time in the store as they were selling to customers, chatting or even reading these illustrated novels. They had a pile of old ones. The novels had pictures. It was almost like a comic book with pictures, and they had pictures in the frame, including the dialogue between the characters. It made for quick reading. But I had gotten burnt once or twice reading all the way through a novel, only to come to the end of the novel and knowing that the last couple of pages were missing from the book. And so I was not going to let that happen again. So if I picked up a new one, I would squint really hard, and I would go to the back page, and I would make sure that it said, "The End." And then if it said that, then I would close it and I'd start at the beginning reading the story. Because I did not want to read a story for which I didn't know the ending. Think about this abrupt ending in Mark to sound like this. The women fled. They were scared. They did not tell anyone. What will you do to share the end of the story? Because we know how it turns out. The children sort of showed us what it looks like to share that story. We gather weekly in the faith that God raised Jesus from the grave that day, and that because of Jesus, we have been reconciled to God. So in a way, the story is still going. It's in the process of being completed. And so if we are squinting at the last page of today's gospel story, we are getting recruited in the writing of the ending. We are getting recruited into telling the end of the story. The women, with their faithfulness and their courage, had dropped this improbable story on the lap of the disciples, and now they're dropping it on our laps for us to keep it going. And so we participate in the writing of the ending of the story by how we live a life that really believes in the hope of resurrection, a life that embodies the radical nature of God's realm as Jesus preached about it. We tell the story, or the end of the story, by how we teach the life-changing lessons that Jesus taught. And we write the end of the story by how we loved like Jesus loved, with a love that overcomes all barriers. The women did share the story, and we get to keep on telling it. And the story is this: Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Amen.